He was standing at the altar when his phone rang, and that single call revealed a daughter he never knew existed and forced him to walk away from the wedding forever. The cathedral breathed with quiet luxury and expectation, every detail polished to perfection. Soft light filtered through stained glass windows, scattering colors across marble floors, while the low murmur of guests blended with the distant swell of music. Rows of people waited, smiling, whispering, certain they were about to witness the beginning of a flawless future. Cameras were ready. Headlines were already written in anticipation. Ethan Collins stood at the altar, his posture straight, his expression composed, a dark-haired, blue-eyed man who looked exactly like someone who had everything under control. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, as did the role he was playing. Successful. Confident. Unshakable. No one in the room could have guessed how detached he felt from the moment unfolding around him. He looked forward, not at his bride, but past her, his thoughts drifting somewhere far from the ceremony. He had agreed to this wedding because it made sense. Because it was expected. Because everyone around him had assured him that love would come later, that respect and stability were enough. He knew, with uncomfortable clarity, that he did not love the woman standing a few steps away from him, radiant and hopeful in white. He felt no panic about that realization, only a dull acceptance, as if he had already resigned himself to a life built on careful compromises. The priest spoke, his voice calm and practiced, but the words barely reached Ethan. He nodded at the right moments, responding automatically, his mind elsewhere. He wondered, briefly, whether this was what regret felt like, or whether regret came later, when it was too late to turn back. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. The sensation was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it cut through him with startling force. His first instinct was irritation. Nothing was supposed to interrupt this moment. He shifted slightly, preparing to ignore it, when a second vibration followed, more insistent. Against his better judgment, he glanced down. The name on the screen erased every other thought in his mind. Rachel. For a fraction of a second, the cathedral disappeared. He was no longer standing at the altar. He was remembering a different life, a different version of himself, one that existed before ambition hardened him, before choices became strategies instead of feelings. He hadn't spoken her name in years. He had convinced himself that chapter was closed, buried, irrelevant. His heart began to race. The phone vibrated again, and something in his chest tightened with a sense of dread he could not explain. Rachel was not someone who called without reason. She never had been. Ethan hesitated, acutely aware of the eyes on him, the stillness of the room, the fragile balance of the moment. Ignoring the call would be easy. Acceptable. Expected. But his hand moved anyway, slow and deliberate, as if acting on instinct rather than logic. He answered. Ethan, her voice came through immediately, strained and trembling, barely holding together. I'm at the hospital. The word sent a sharp chill through him. What happened? He asked, lowering his voice, turning slightly away from the altar. There was a pause, heavy and uneven, as if she were gathering the strength to say something she had been carrying alone for far too long. There's a little girl, Rachel said finally. She's 4 years old. She has dark hair and blue eyes. She's yours. The world seemed to tilt. Ethan's grip tightened on the phone as the cathedral around him blurred into noise and color. He felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted without warning, opening a fault line straight through the life he was about to commit to. She needs surgery, Rachel continued, her voice breaking now. And I don't have the money. I wouldn't have called if there was any other way. Ethan said nothing. He couldn't. His breath felt shallow, uneven, his thoughts colliding too fast to form words. Somewhere nearby, the priest cleared his throat gently, waiting. His bride smiled nervously, sensing something wrong but not yet understanding what. Ethan looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time since the ceremony began. In that moment, everything became painfully clear. The wedding. The expectations. The future he had chosen because it was easy. And somewhere in a hospital room, a child he had never known existed was fighting for her life. "I'm coming," he said into the phone, his voice low but steady. "I'll be there." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The cathedral was silent now, every gaze fixed on him, confusion rippling through the room. Ethan took one step back from the altar. And in that single movement, the life he had planned began to fall apart. Rachel's hands were shaking so badly she had to sit on them to keep from dropping the phone. The hospital corridor felt endless and painfully bright, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above her as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Nurses moved past her with practiced calm, their shoes squeaking against the floor, carrying charts in quiet urgency from one room to another. To them, this was another shift. To Rachel, it was the moment her life threatened to collapse completely. She stared at the closed door across the hall, where a small sign bore her daughter's name in neat black letters. Lily Howard. 4 years old. The door separated her from the steady beeping of machines and the thin, fragile body of a child who should have been running, laughing, asking too many questions about the world. Instead, Lily lay still beneath white sheets, dark hair spread across the pillow, her blue eyes closed in exhausted sleep after hours of pain. Rachel pressed her forehead against the cool wall and forced herself to breathe. She had sworn she would never call Ethan. That promise had been made years ago, forged in humiliation and heartbreak the night he walked away from her fear with a laugh. Back then, she had learned the hard way what it meant to be invisible to someone you loved. She had rebuilt herself piece by piece, learning how to survive alone, how to be strong for a child who depended on her for everything. But strength had limits. The doctor's words echoed relentlessly in her mind. Congenital complication. Surgery required. High risk without immediate treatment. The numbers he had spoken afterward had barely registered at first, until reality set in with crushing force. There was no charity that could act fast enough. No insurance that would cover what Lily needed. And time was something they did not have. Rachel looked down at her phone, at the call log showing Ethan's name. Her chest tightened with a mix of dread, resentment, and something dangerously close to hope. She hated herself for that last feeling more than anything else. What if he didn't believe her? What if he thought this was another lie? What if he never came? A nurse approached gently. "She's stable for now," she said softly. "But we can't wait too long." Rachel nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you." When the nurse left, Rachel stood and walked slowly into Lily's room. The familiar antiseptic smell wrapped around her as she approached the bed. She brushed a strand of hair away from her daughter's forehead, careful not to disturb the 4-line taped to her small hand. "Mommy?" Lily murmured, her eyes fluttering open. "I'm here," Rachel said immediately, forcing a smile that felt too heavy for her face. "I'm not going anywhere." Lily studied her with quiet seriousness that always struck Rachel as far older than 4 years. "My chest hurts," she whispered. Rachel's heart broke anew. "I know, sweetheart. The doctors are helping you." Lily nodded slowly, trusting without question, then closed her eyes again. Rachel stayed there for a long time, holding her daughter's hand, listening to the machines, letting memories surface despite her attempts to keep them buried. She remembered Ethan's blue eyes, so similar to Lily's, the way ambition had always pulled him forward, the way she had once believed love would be enough to keep him close. She wondered what kind of man he had become. Whether he had softened or hardened with success. Whether there was still room in him for compassion, or whether she had just torn open a door that should have remained closed forever. When she finally stepped back into the hallway, her phone buzzed. A message. "I'm on my way." Rachel stared at the screen until the words blurred. Her knees weakened, and she leaned against the wall, one hand pressed to her mouth to keep from sobbing out loud. Relief crashed into fear almost instantly. Ethan coming meant answers, consequences, and a reckoning she had postponed for 4 years. She wiped her tears, straightened her shoulders, and looked once more toward Lily's room. No matter what happened next, she reminded herself, she had done this for her daughter. Not for forgiveness. Not for reconciliation. For survival. And as the sound of hurried footsteps echoed faintly down the corridor, Rachel understood that the past was no longer something she could outrun. It was finally catching up to all of them. Ethan barely remembered leaving the cathedral. The echo of footsteps behind him, the stunned silence, the sound of his bride calling his name all blurred together into something distant and unreal. He moved on instinct alone, pushing through the heavy doors, breathing in the cold air outside as if it were the first real breath he had taken in years. His driver was already rushing toward him, confusion written across his face, but Ethan didn't stop to explain. He gave the hospital address with a voice that left no room for questions and slid into the back seat, his hands shaking for the first time in his adult life. As the car sped through the city, memories surfaced without mercy. Rachel's laugh from years ago, sharp and warm at the same time. The night she had told him she was pregnant, her voice quiet but brave. His own reaction replayed like a wound that refused to close, the careless dismissal, the arrogance, the certainty that his life was too important to be interrupted by inconvenient truths. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, staring at reflections of lights rushing past, and felt something inside him crack open. The hospital loomed ahead, bright and unforgiving. Ethan was already moving before the car fully stopped, ignoring the driver's attempt to follow. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and urgency. He asked for Lily Howard at the front desk, his voice controlled but tight, and was directed down a long corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him. Rachel saw him before he reached her. She stood slowly, her posture stiff, her green eyes locking onto his with an expression he could not immediately read. It wasn't anger. It wasn't relief. It was something heavier, something formed by years of doing everything alone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You came," she said finally, her voice flat, almost disbelieving. "I came as fast as I could," Ethan replied. His eyes moved past her, toward the closed door behind her, toward the child he had only learned existed less than an hour ago. "Where is she?" Rachel hesitated, then stepped aside. "She's sleeping. The medication helps, but it won't last." Ethan nodded and followed her into the room. Lily lay small and pale against the white sheets, tubes, and wires carefully arranged around her fragile body. Her dark hair curled softly against the pillow, and even in sleep, the resemblance struck him with brutal clarity. The shape of her face, the line of her lashes, the unmistakable blue of her eyes when they fluttered briefly before settling again. His eyes. His knees nearly gave out. He reached the side of the bed slowly, as if afraid that moving too quickly might break something irreversible. He did not touch her at first. He simply looked, breathing shallowly, absorbing the reality that this child existed because of him, and that he had not been there for a single day of her life. "She's 4, Rachel said quietly behind him. "She loves drawing and refuses to sleep without the light on. She hates broccoli and asks too many questions." Ethan closed his eyes. Each detail felt like a reminder of everything he had missed. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, though the question felt hollow even as he spoke it. Rachel crossed her arms, not defensively, but to hold herself together. "I did," she said. "You didn't listen. After that, I decided she deserved better than being an inconvenience." He turned to face her, guilt flooding his chest so violently it hurt to breathe. "I was wrong," he said. "About everything." Rachel let out a short, tired breath. "Being right now doesn't change the past." "I know," Ethan said. "But let me change this. Whatever she needs, I'll cover it. The surgery, the doctors, everything." Rachel studied his face, searching for conditions, for hesitation, for the man who had once laughed at her fear. She found none of that. Only panic, regret, and something raw and unguarded. "I didn't call you for money," she said carefully. "I called you because she's running out of time." Ethan nodded immediately. "Then we won't waste another second." A nurse entered quietly, updating them on Lily's condition, explaining procedures and timelines. Ethan listened intently, asking questions, absorbing every word as if his attention alone could protect her. When the costs were mentioned, he didn't flinch. He signed forms without reading them, his signature firm despite the chaos inside him. Later, when the nurse left, Ethan finally reached out and gently took Lily's small hand in his. The warmth of her skin sent a jolt through him, grounding and devastating all at once. "I'm here," he whispered, unsure whether she could hear him or not. "I'm not going anywhere." Rachel watched from a few steps away, her expression guarded but shaken. She had prepared herself for anger, for denial, for indifference. What she hadn't prepared for was the sight of Ethan Collins standing helplessly beside a hospital bed, stripped of power and certainty, learning in a single night what love actually demanded. And as Lily shifted slightly in her sleep, tightening her fingers around his without waking, Ethan understood that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. Morning came quietly, filtered through the thin hospital curtains in pale shades of gray and gold. Ethan had not slept. He remained in the chair beside Lily's bed, his jacket folded over the back, his shirt wrinkled, his mind unwilling to rest even when his body begged for it. Every small movement Lily made pulled his attention instantly back to her, as if she might disappear if he looked away for even a second. Rachel watched him from across the room as she poured herself a cup of stale hospital coffee. She looked exhausted, her dark auburn hair slipping loose from its tie, shadows settling beneath her green eyes. She had lived like this for days already, running on fear and instinct, but seeing Ethan here now complicated everything in ways she had not prepared for. "You should go home," she said quietly. "Change, at least." "I'm not leaving," Ethan replied without hesitation. His voice was calm, but there was something immovable beneath it. "Not today." Rachel studied him for a long moment, then looked away. She had learned long ago that arguing with a determined man like Ethan was pointless, yet this version of him felt unfamiliar. Gone was the arrogance, the effortless authority. What stood in front of her now was a man stripped down to something raw and uncertain. The doctor arrived mid-morning, accompanied by a nurse carrying a clipboard thick with documents. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with practiced precision, explaining the risks, the procedure, the narrow window they had before Lily's condition could worsen. Rachel listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Ethan absorbed every detail with intense focus. "She needs surgery within the next 48 hours, the doctor concluded. "The sooner, the better." Ethan nodded once. "Do whatever you need to do." Rachel looked at him sharply. "It's not that simple." Ethan met her gaze. "It is. I'll take responsibility for all of it." There was a brief pause, heavy with unspoken history. "This doesn't buy you forgiveness," Rachel said quietly. "I know," Ethan answered. "I'm not trying to buy anything." When the doctor left, silence filled the room again, broken only by the steady beeping of the monitor. Lily stirred, her eyes fluttering open slowly. She frowned, disoriented, then noticed Ethan sitting beside her. "Mommy," she murmured. "I'm right here," Rachel said instantly, moving closer. Lily's gaze shifted back to Ethan, studying his face with innocent curiosity. "Who are you?" The question struck deeper than any accusation ever could. Ethan swallowed, forcing himself to breathe evenly. He did not look at Rachel for permission. He did not invent a lie. "My name is Ethan," he said softly. "I'm someone who should have been here a long time ago." Lily considered this, then nodded as if that explanation was enough for now. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel turned away, blinking rapidly. She had imagined this moment in her worst nightmares, feared it, delayed it, but seeing it unfold so simply, so gently, unraveled something inside her. Later that afternoon, while Lily slept again, Rachel and Ethan stood in the hallway outside her room. The hospital hummed around them, indifferent and relentless. "You left," Rachel said suddenly, her voice low but sharp. "You didn't just walk away from me. You walked away from a future you didn't even bother to ask about." Ethan did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. "I was a coward," he said when she finished. "I chose ambition because it didn't need me to feel anything. And I convinced myself that made me strong." Rachel's jaw tightened. "And now?" "Now I know strength is staying when everything tells you to run." She laughed quietly, without humor. "You don't get redemption just because you figured that out too late." "I know," Ethan said again. "But Lily doesn't deserve to pay for who I used to be." Rachel looked at him then, really looked, and saw something she hadn't expected to see so clearly. Not confidence. Not control. Fear. Fear of losing a child he had only just met, fear of being unworthy of her, fear of failing again. "I'm not promising you anything," Rachel said. "Not trust. Not forgiveness. Not a place in our lives." "I'm not asking for promises," Ethan replied. "Just don't shut the door." She hesitated, then nodded once. "We'll see." As evening settled in and the hospital lights dimmed, Ethan returned to Lily's bedside, taking her small hand again as if it were the most fragile and important thing he had ever held. Rachel watched from the doorway, her heart heavy and conflicted. She had called him because she had no choice. She had never imagined he would answer by staying. And somewhere between fear and hope, she realized that the hardest part of all was just beginning. The hours before the surgery stretched endlessly, bending time into something heavy and oppressive. Ethan stayed close to Lily's bed, rising only when nurses needed space, his attention fixed on every shift of her expression, every subtle change in the rhythm of the machines. He had spent years making decisions that moved markets and altered lives at a distance, but none of that experience prepared him for the helplessness of waiting beside a small hospital bed with nothing to offer but presence. Rachel tried to keep herself busy, organizing paperwork, answering questions from doctors, pretending that control still existed somewhere within reach. Every so often her eyes drifted back to Ethan, as if she needed to confirm that he was still there, that this wasn't another cruel illusion created by exhaustion and fear. He was quieter than she remembered, more restrained, as if every word now carried weight he was afraid to misuse. When the nurse finally arrived to take Lily for pre-op, the moment shattered what little composure Rachel had left. Lily clung to her hand, her small fingers tightening instinctively as the bed began to move. "Mommy, don't go," she whispered, panic flickering in her blue eyes. "I'm right here," Rachel said quickly, leaning close, pressing her forehead gently to Lily's. "I'll be waiting when you wake up. I promise." Lily nodded uncertainly, then turned her head toward Ethan, who stood frozen at the foot of the bed, fear written openly across his face. "Will you stay too?" she asked. The question broke him. "I'll be right outside," Ethan said, his voice rough but steady. "I'm not leaving." She seemed satisfied with that, her grip loosening just slightly as the nurses began to will her away. Rachel followed until the doors marked restricted closed between them, the soft click of the lock sounding far louder than it should have. The waiting room felt too small, too bright, filled with strangers living out their own quiet emergencies. Rachel sat rigidly in one of the plastic chairs, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Ethan stood at first, pacing in short, controlled movements, then eventually sat beside her, close enough to feel her tension but not touching her without invitation. Minutes passed. Then hours. No one spoke much. Words felt inadequate, even intrusive. Occasionally a nurse would pass by, offering brief updates, nothing definitive, nothing comforting enough to ease the knot in Rachel's chest. Ethan listened intently, absorbing every fragment of information as if it were oxygen. At one point, Rachel's control finally cracked. Her shoulders began to shake, silent tears spilling over despite her efforts to remain composed. Without thinking, Ethan reached out, then hesitated, his hand hovering uncertainly in the space between them. Rachel noticed and gave a small nod. He placed his hand over hers, warm and steady, not squeezing, not pulling her closer, simply anchoring her in the moment. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The quiet support was enough. "This is my fault," he said softly after a long silence. "If I had been here, if I had known sooner." Rachel shook her head weakly. "No," she said. "This happened whether you were here or not. Don't take that from me too. I won't let guilt be the only thing that brings you closer to her." Ethan nodded, accepting the boundary without argument. "Then let it be love," he said quietly. "Even if I'm learning it too late." The surgeon finally appeared as evening settled in, his expression tired but composed. Rachel stood so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Ethan rose beside her, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "The surgery went as planned," the doctor said carefully. "There were complications, but we managed them. She's stable for now." Rachel's legs nearly gave out. She covered her mouth, a sob escaping before she could stop it. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, relief flooding through him so powerfully it left him dizzy. "You can see her soon," the doctor continued. "She'll be in recovery for a while." When they were finally allowed into the room, Lily lay pale and still, surrounded by tubes and monitors once again, but this time the danger had shifted from immediate to uncertain. Rachel went to her side instantly, brushing hair from her daughter's forehead, whispering reassurances even though Lily was still unconscious. Ethan stood back for a moment, watching them, understanding with painful clarity how much ground he had to make up. Then Lily stirred slightly, her fingers twitching as if searching. Ethan stepped closer, carefully, and offered his hand. Her small fingers wrapped around it weakly, instinctively. Rachel looked up at him then, her eyes red and exhausted, and for the first time she didn't pull away. That night, as the hospital settled into uneasy quiet, Ethan remained seated beside Lily's bed, refusing to leave even when Rachel urged him to rest. He watched over her, holding her hand, learning the shape of a love that demanded nothing but presence and patience. And as he sat there in the dim light, Ethan understood that the surgery had not only changed Lily's future. It had irrevocably changed his own, stripping away the life he had planned and replacing it with one he had never known he needed. The days after the surgery moved in a strange, uneven rhythm, measured not by clocks but by Lily's breathing, by the numbers on the monitors, by the cautious expressions of doctors who refused to promise too much too soon. Recovery was not dramatic or immediate. It came slowly, in fragile increments that demanded patience Ethan had never been forced to learn before. Lily slept most of the time, her small body exhausted from the fight it had endured. When she woke, it was only for minutes at first, her eyes unfocused, her voice barely a whisper. Rachel never left her side for long. She learned every sound the machines made, every shift in Lily's expression, her nerves constantly stretched tight with the fear that something could go wrong again at any moment. Ethan stayed too. At first, it felt almost unreal to Rachel, seeing him there every morning when she arrived and every night when she finally allowed herself to rest. He brought coffee she rarely drank, food she forgot to eat, and paperwork she didn't have the strength to face. He spoke little, choosing instead to listen, to observe, to make himself useful without imposing. The man who once commanded entire rooms now waited quietly in hospital corridors, asking permission before sitting, before touching, before saying anything at all. On the third day, Lily opened her eyes fully for the first time since the operation. Rachel noticed immediately, her breath catching as she leaned forward. "Sweetheart," she whispered. Lily blinked slowly, her blue eyes cloudy with fatigue, then focused on Rachel's face. "Mommy," she murmured. Tears spilled down Rachel's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. Lily's gaze drifted past her, settling on Ethan, who stood a few steps away, frozen in place as if afraid to move. "You stayed," Lily said quietly. The words were simple, innocent, and devastating all at once. "Yes," Ethan answered, his voice thick. "I stayed." She studied him for a long moment, then gave a faint nod, as if confirming something to herself. "Okay," she said, closing her eyes again. That single word hit him harder than any accusation ever could. Later that day, the doctor pulled Ethan and Rachel aside. He explained the road ahead carefully, outlining follow-up treatments, restrictions, and the long-term outlook. The danger had passed, but Lily's recovery would require time, monitoring, and consistency. It was not something that could be solved quickly or cheaply. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Whatever she needs," he said. "I'll handle it." Rachel stiffened slightly. "This isn't a transaction," she said quietly once the doctor left. "I know," Ethan replied immediately. "And I'm not trying to make it one. I just want to take responsibility." She searched his face, wary of old patterns, of grand gestures meant to erase guilt. What she found instead was exhaustion and resolve, neither of which could be faked easily. That evening, when Lily was resting comfortably, Rachel finally allowed herself to sit down in the small family lounge across the hall. The tension she had carried for days began to seep out of her, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. Ethan joined her a few minutes later, sitting across from her, his posture unguarded. "I need to say something," Rachel said quietly. "And I need you to listen." He nodded. "I will." "You don't get to step in and rewrite her life," she continued. "You don't get to be the hero who shows up at the last moment and fixes everything. Lily doesn't need saving. She needs stability." "I understand," Ethan said. "And I'm not asking to take over. I just want to be here. However you'll allow it." Rachel let out a slow breath. "Being here means more than hospital rooms," she said. "It means showing up when things are boring, and hard, and ungrateful. It means being there even when she doesn't need you anymore. Ethan didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was steady. That's the part I'm most afraid of failing. Rachel looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time she didn't see the man who had laughed at her fear. She saw someone confronting the consequences of his choices without trying to escape them. The press began circling soon after. Calls came in, messages piling up, rumors spreading about the wedding that never happened and the hospital he had disappeared into. Ethan ignored them all. When his assistant finally reached him, warning of fallout, of board members demanding answers, he ended the call with a single sentence. "I'll deal with it later." For the first time in his life, later mattered less than now. That night, Rachel found him asleep in the chair beside Lily's bed, his head tilted awkwardly, one hand still holding Lily's fingers. The sight tightened her chest in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. She covered him with her jacket anyway. Standing there in the dim light, watching her daughter breathe steadily while the man who had once broken her now kept vigil beside her, Rachel understood something with painful clarity. Healing was not just happening in Lily's body. It was beginning to happen in all of them. The outside world did not remain silent for long. It never did when someone like Ethan Collins stepped out of line. By the end of the week, his name was everywhere, whispered through hospital corridors by strangers who pretended not to stare, splashed across screens and headlines that reduced the most painful moments of his life to sharp, clickable phrases. The abandoned bride. The vanished groom. The secret child. The hospital. Rachel saw the first article by accident, a notification lighting up her phone while she waited for coffee in the hospital cafeteria. She didn't open it at first. She already knew the shape of the story it would tell, and she hated how easily the world could turn private fear into public spectacle. Still, the weight of it pressed on her chest, a familiar reminder that nothing involving Ethan would ever be simple. Ethan read everything. He sat alone in a quiet corner near Lily's room, scrolling slowly, absorbing every accusation and speculation without reacting. He did not call his lawyers. He did not issue statements. For once, he did not try to control the narrative. The truth, messy and incomplete as it was, mattered more to him now than reputation ever had. The board of directors called that afternoon. He took the call outside, pacing the narrow courtyard behind the hospital, listening as familiar voices spoke in careful tones about responsibility, image, and damage control. They asked him when he planned to return. They asked how long this situation would last. They asked, without saying it directly, whether the child was worth the fallout. Ethan closed his eyes. "I won't leave," he said simply. There was a pause on the line, thick and uncomfortable. "You're throwing everything away," one of them said finally. "No," Ethan replied. "I'm choosing something I should have chosen a long time ago." He ended the call before they could respond. When he returned inside, Rachel was standing by Lily's bed, helping her sip water carefully. Lily looked stronger now, color slowly returning to her cheeks, her eyes more alert. She smiled faintly when she saw Ethan, a small, tired smile that felt like a victory. "Daddy," she said softly, testing the word as if unsure whether it would stay. The sound of it hit him harder than any headline ever could. He nodded, unable to trust his voice, and sat down beside her, taking her hand. Rachel watched them, her emotions tangled and conflicted. She had spent years protecting Lily from absence and disappointment, teaching herself not to rely on anyone who could disappear. Watching Ethan step so fully into this role scared her more than his earlier cruelty ever had. Hope was dangerous. Hope asked for trust. That evening, after Lily fell asleep, Rachel finally confronted him. "You're blowing up your life," she said quietly, standing near the window where the city lights blurred into soft streaks. "And I didn't ask you to." "I know," Ethan replied. "I'm not doing this for gratitude." "Then why?" she asked, her voice tight. "Because every time I think about leaving," he said, "I see her face. And I remember how easy it was for me to walk away before. I won't do that again." Rachel turned to face him fully. "And when this gets harder? When she's better and you don't feel needed anymore?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "That's when staying matters most." She searched his face for arrogance, for certainty that might crumble later. What she saw instead was fear, honest and unshielded, and something deeper beneath it, a commitment that did not depend on applause or forgiveness. Lily was discharged 2 days later. Walking out of the hospital felt surreal. The sunlight seemed too bright, the air too open after weeks of enclosed fear. Ethan carried Lily carefully, her arms wrapped loosely around his neck, while Rachel followed beside them, her steps unsteady with relief and exhaustion. Cameras flashed from a distance, voices called out questions, but Ethan didn't look back. He placed Lily gently into the car and closed the door as if sealing the world out. At Rachel's apartment, life began again in small, tentative steps. Medication schedules replaced hospital monitors. Quiet naps replaced alarms. Ethan stayed, sleeping on the couch, helping with meals, learning routines that had never included him before. He didn't announce his intentions or ask for reassurance. He simply showed up each morning and remained each night. One evening, as Lily colored at the table, she looked up suddenly. "Are you going away again?" she asked, her voice careful. Ethan crouched beside her, meeting her eyes. "No," he said. "I'm staying." She considered this, then nodded and returned to her drawing, satisfied. Rachel turned away quickly, blinking back tears she hadn't expected. She realized then that whatever came next, whatever pain or healing awaited them, the hardest choice had already been made. Ethan Collins had walked away from an altar once. This time, he was not walking away at all. Life after the hospital did not rush forward in dramatic leaps. It unfolded slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether this fragile new reality was strong enough to hold. The apartment felt smaller now with Ethan in it, but also warmer, filled with sounds Rachel had never allowed herself to imagine before. Morning footsteps that weren't hers alone. Quiet conversations over breakfast. Laughter drifting down the hallway when Lily insisted on telling the same story twice. Recovery demanded patience. Lily tired easily, her body still learning how to trust itself again. Some days she woke up smiling, eager to draw or sit by the window and watch people pass below. Other days she clung to Rachel, overwhelmed by sudden waves of exhaustion or fear that came without warning. Ethan learned those rhythms quickly. He learned when to step in and when to stay back, when to distract and when to simply sit beside her in silence, letting her small hand rest in his. Rachel watched him constantly, even when she pretended not to. She noticed how he memorized medication schedules without being asked, how he set alarms on his phone for doctor appointments, how he adjusted his entire life without complaint or announcement. There were no grand speeches, no attempts to define what they were or what they might become. Just consistency, steady and unassuming. The consequences of Ethan's choice arrived quietly but firmly. His absence from public life became permanent. The company announced his resignation in carefully worded statements, the press speculating endlessly about scandal and downfall. Offers came anyway, lucrative and tempting, but Ethan declined most of them, choosing smaller projects he could manage without disappearing for days at a time. For the first time, success was measured not by growth or profit, but by presence. Rachel struggled with the shift more than she expected. She had built herself around independence, around the belief that needing no one was the safest way to survive. Allowing Ethan into their lives meant allowing uncertainty, vulnerability, and the terrifying possibility of loss. Some nights she lay awake, listening to the quiet apartment, wondering if she was foolish to believe this could last. One evening, after Lily had fallen asleep on the couch with crayons still clutched in her hand, Rachel and Ethan sat together in the dim light of the living room. The city hummed softly outside, distant and indifferent. "I don't know how to trust this," Rachel admitted finally. "I don't know how to trust you without losing myself." Ethan didn't rush to answer. He had learned that silence mattered. "You don't have to trust the future," he said carefully. "Just the present. Just today." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw no urgency in his expression, no demand. Only patience. Weeks turned into months. Lily grew stronger, her laughter returning in full, her step steadier, her curiosity boundless. She started preschool again, proudly telling anyone who would listen about her drawings, her favorite colors, and her dad who picked her up every afternoon. The word dad settled into their lives naturally, without ceremony, becoming part of the everyday language of home. Rachel noticed when it stopped hurting to hear it. On the anniversary of Lily's surgery, they went to the park together. The day was warm, sunlight filtering through the trees as Lily ran across the grass, her dark hair flying behind her, her blue eyes bright with life. Ethan watched her with quiet intensity, every movement a reminder of what could have been lost. "She's happy," Rachel said softly, standing beside him. Ethan nodded. "That's all that matters." Lily ran back to them, breathless and smiling, grabbing both of their hands at once. "Come play," she demanded. They followed her, awkward and laughing, leaving behind the weight of everything that had nearly destroyed them. That night, after Lily was asleep, Rachel stood at the window while Ethan washed dishes in the small kitchen. The reflection of the room stared back at her, different from the lonely version she remembered. She turned slowly. "I don't regret calling you," she said. "Even though I was afraid." Ethan dried his hands and met her gaze. "I don't regret answering." She hesitated, then stepped closer, not into his arms, but into the shared space between them that no longer felt empty. "We move slowly," she said. "For her. And for me." He nodded. "As slow as you need." Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, unaware of the quiet miracle taking shape inside a modest apartment. No headlines followed them now. No grand declarations marked their ending. There was only a man who chose to stay, a woman who chose to allow it, and a child who ran freely into a future that almost never happened. Sometimes one phone call changes everything. And sometimes, choosing not to run is what finally makes a life whole.